Breaking: Iran challenges U.S. Navy. Pentagon launches secret operation to reopen Hormuz. For 43 years, since Revolutionary Guards stormed the American embassy in Tehran and redrew every assumption about Middle Eastern power, one principle has governed the balance in the Persian Gulf. The United States controls the sea. Iran controls the threat to close it. And that threat, that singular card Iran has played in every crisis since 1979, has kept American military planners awake through 4 decades of standoffs, sanctions, and near wars. It is the strategic ace that has made Iran untouchable, despite possessing a navy that could be destroyed in 72 hours by a single American carrier strike group. But something happened in the Strait of Hormuz 3 days ago that violates that entire framework. Iran challenged the U.S. Navy directly. Not with words, not with proxy forces, not with mining operations conducted under cover of darkness. Iran sent fast attack craft into contested waters and fired on American-flagged commercial vessels in broad daylight, with international media watching. This was not a miscalculation by a rogue commander. This was not an accident in the fog of confrontation. This was deliberate escalation ordered from Tehran. Read that again because the implications are staggering. Iran just threw away the single deterrent that has protected it from regime change operations since the Islamic Revolution. And the Pentagon's response was not what anyone expected. Not airstrikes, not a massive naval buildup, not public threats of retaliation. Instead, the United States launched something far more sophisticated. A classified operation that does not show up on satellite imagery, does not involve visible troop movements, and does not generate the news headlines that typically accompany American military action. Stay with me because what just happened in the Strait of Hormuz represents the most consequential shift in Gulf power dynamics since Desert Storm. And the full weight of it has not landed yet. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane. It is the most strategically significant choke point on the planet, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 30% of the world's seaborne oil passes through it every single day. 18 million barrels. That is not an abstraction. That is the difference between $7 gasoline and $3 gasoline in American markets. That is the difference between industrial economies functioning normally and supply chains collapsing under energy inflation that no central bank can control. Iran has understood this leverage for half a century. The threat to close Hormuz has been Tehran's insurance policy against American military intervention, its bargaining chip in nuclear negotiations, its economic weapon when sanctions tighten around the regime's throat. Every American administration since Carter has run the same classified war game. What happens if Iran actually closes the strait? The answer has always been the same. Global economic catastrophe, lasting weeks, even if the U.S. Navy reopens the passage within days. Oil prices spiking to $200 per barrel. Insurance rates on commercial shipping making transit economically impossible even after military threats are neutralized. Panic buying emptying gas stations across the developed world. That scenario, that nightmare calculation, is what has kept American presidents from pulling triggers they desperately wanted to pull. It is why Iran still has a nuclear program. It is why the regime survived the maximum pressure campaign. It is why the Islamic Republic has outlasted every prediction of its imminent collapse. But here's what makes this current moment fundamentally different from every previous crisis. Iran just demonstrated that it no longer believes the Hormuz threat works. When those IRGC fast attack craft opened fire on the container ship Marathon Voyager at 0647 local time on Tuesday morning, they were not enforcing a blockade. They were testing something. The vessel was transiting international waters 17 nautical miles northeast of Omani Territorial Sea. It was flagged to the United States, crewed by Filipino nationals carrying containerized cargo from Singapore to Rotterdam. It posed zero military threat. It violated no exclusion zone because no exclusion zone had been declared. The Iranian gunboats approached without radio communication, without warning shots, without any of the protocols that govern even hostile naval encounters. They simply opened fire with deck-mounted heavy machine guns, struck the ship's superstructure in 14 places, killed 1 crew member, wounded 3 others, then broke off and returned to Iranian waters. 3 hours later, it happened again. The bulk carrier Estuary Horizon was fired upon 9 nautical miles off the Iranian coast. Then again at 1300 hours. The tanker Pacific Endurance took fire while transiting the designated eastbound traffic lane in the separation scheme. 5 attacks in 8 hours on civilian vessels that were not challenging Iranian sovereignty, not conducting intelligence operations, not doing anything except moving commercial cargo through international shipping lanes that have been open since the Second World War. This was not enforcement. This was provocation. Iran was forcing a response. The question is why? Why would Tehran deliberately shatter the ambiguity that has protected it, abandon the strategy that has worked for 4 decades, and trigger exactly the kind of American military reaction that the regime has spent its entire existence avoiding? The answer is not visible in the Strait of Hormuz. It is visible in what is happening inside Iran. The Islamic Republic is not experiencing protests. It is not facing economic pressure. It is not dealing with political opposition. It is undergoing structural disintegration. This is not a government with internal tensions. This is a government that has ceased to function as a unified entity in any meaningful operational sense. The Supreme Leader issued a directive 17 days ago ordering the IRGC to stand down from all provocative naval operations pending resolution of negotiations with European intermediaries. That order was ignored. Not quietly circumvented, not creatively reinterpreted. Flatly ignored by commanders who took operational action in direct contradiction to explicit guidance from the highest authority in the Iranian system. That gap, that distance between the directive and the reality, is the single most devastating revelation to emerge from this crisis. It means the control structures that have held the Islamic Republic together since Khomeini's death no longer operate. When a supreme leader issues orders and military commanders ignore them, you do not have a government. You have competing power centers in the early stages of a fracture that historically ends in one of two ways: coup or collapse. Either the military removes civilian leadership and takes direct control, or the institutional framework disintegrates and regional commanders begin operating as independent warlords answering to no central authority. Iran is now somewhere between those two endpoints. And what makes this moment so historically dangerous is that neither the Supreme Leader's faction nor the IRGC hardliners who defied him can afford to back down without losing the internal power struggle that this defiance has made inevitable. President Pezeshkian wanted de-escalation. He has been in quiet contact with Omani intermediaries for 6 weeks, attempting to construct an off-ramp that would satisfy American demands without producing the kind of humiliating climb-down that would end his political viability. He was making progress. The outlines of an agreement were taking shape. Iran would halt uranium enrichment above 20% purity, accept enhanced inspections, and commit to no further attacks on commercial shipping. In return, the United States would unfreeze $18 billion in Iranian oil revenue held in South Korean and Iraqi banks, permit limited civilian nuclear cooperation, and lift sanctions on Iran's pharmaceutical and medical equipment imports. It was not a grand bargain. It was a transactional arrangement that gave both sides something while postponing the fundamental conflicts for another day. European diplomats who brokered the framework described it as the most promising diplomatic opening since the collapse of the JCPOA. Then the IRGC Navy fired on American ships and destroyed 6 weeks of diplomatic groundwork in 8 hours. That was not coincidence. That was sabotage. IRGC Commander Vahidi has been systematically blocking presidential appointments, installing loyalists in intelligence ministry positions, and moving assets into defensive positions around Tehran that suggest preparation for internal rather than external conflict. The Revolutionary Guard is not defending Iran from America. It is defending itself from an Iranian president who threatened to negotiate away the confrontation that justifies the Guard's budget, political power, and economic empire. This is not geopolitics. This is an internal power struggle where both sides have decided that survival requires escalation rather than compromise. And the United States just walked into the middle of it. The Pentagon's response was not visible because it was not designed to be visible. No carrier strike group surged into the Gulf. No bombers deployed to regional bases. No press conferences announced retaliatory measures. Instead, something else happened that only became clear when shipping data from the Strait of Hormuz showed a pattern that made no operational sense under normal circumstances. Commercial vessels began avoiding the strait entirely. Not because they were ordered to, not because insurance companies canceled coverage, not because Iran declared an exclusion zone. Ships simply stopped coming. The westbound traffic lane that normally carries 14 to 18 transits daily dropped to 0. The eastbound lane dropped to 3 transits in 48 hours. All of them vessels that had already entered the strait before the attacks and had no choice but to complete the passage. New traffic stopped. Tankers that should have entered Hormuz on Wednesday morning instead turned south and began routing around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 21 days and $600,000 in fuel costs to voyages from the Persian Gulf to European markets. Container ships bound for Asian ports diverted to alternative routes that do not exist, stacking up in holding patterns off the coast of Oman, while shipping companies calculated whether to wait for the strait to reopen or commit to the ruinously expensive African route. Within 60 hours, the flow of oil through Hormuz had dropped by 73%. Not because Iran closed the strait, because the United States did. This was not a blockade in the traditional sense. American warships were not stopping vessels. The Navy was not enforcing a declared exclusion. What happened was infinitely more sophisticated and infinitely more devastating. American intelligence identified every shipping company, every insurance underwriter, every port operator, and every vessel owner with ships scheduled to transit Hormuz in the next 72 hours. Then, classified briefings were delivered to the security directors of those companies. The briefings contained detailed intelligence on Iranian naval dispositions, attack patterns, and targeting criteria. They included geospatial data showing that Iranian fast attack craft were operating in patterns that made interdiction of commercial traffic not just possible, but likely. And they included a single recommendation delivered in language that was technically advisory but operationally unmistakable. Avoid the Strait of Hormuz until further notice. That recommendation had no legal force. It was not a prohibition, but it had something far more powerful. It had American intelligence credibility behind it, and for the lawyers at shipping companies who make risk calculations about where to send billion-dollar vessels and $300 million cargoes, that credibility was enough. The ships stopped coming. And when the ships stopped coming, Iran's leverage evaporated. Here is what Tehran failed to understand about the trap it is now sitting in. Iran's power in the Strait of Hormuz has never been the ability to close the passage militarily. The Iranian Navy cannot stop the U.S. Fifth Fleet from clearing the strait in 72 hours if Washington decides to do it. Iran's power has always been the threat, the uncertainty, the economic panic that the mere possibility of closure creates. That threat only works if commercial shipping keeps moving through Hormuz while Iran makes menacing noises about its ability to stop that movement. It is a psychological operation that requires both sides to participate in the charade. Iran threatens closure. The world worries about closure, oil prices spike on the worry, and Iran gets leverage without firing a shot. But Iran just fired shots, and the moment Iran actually attacked commercial vessels, it gave the United States permission to do what it has wanted to do for 40 years. Remove the ambiguity. Now, shipping companies are not making decisions based on Iranian threats. They are making decisions based on documented Iranian attacks. And those companies have no incentive to resume Hormuz transits until someone guarantees their ships will not be fired upon. Iran cannot provide that guarantee because Iran just demonstrated it will fire on ships. The United States will not provide that guarantee until Iran surrenders the capability to make the guarantee necessary. The result is a perfect strategic trap. The longer shipping avoids Hormuz, the more economic damage Iran suffers. But the moment Iran promises to stop attacking ships in order to get shipping to resume, it loses the only leverage that made it strategically relevant. Tehran is now choosing between economic strangulation and strategic irrelevance. And both choices end with the regime weaker than it was before this crisis began. Look at what this means for Iran's economic position. 73% of Iran's export revenue comes from oil. 90% of that oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz because geography offers no alternative. Iranian oil fields are located in the southwestern provinces near the Gulf Coast. Pipelines run from the fields to export terminals at Karg Island, Levan Island, and Bandar Abbas. All of those terminals export through Hormuz because there is no other way to get Iranian oil to international markets. Iran has no pipeline to the Caspian Sea. It has no pipeline to the Mediterranean. It has no Pacific coast. If Iranian oil is going to reach buyers in China, India, and gray market customers in Southeast Asia, it has to move by tanker through the Strait of Hormuz. And if commercial tankers will not transit Hormuz because the strait is too dangerous, Iranian oil stays in storage tanks until those tanks are full. Then production has to shut down. Iran's oil storage capacity is approximately 85 million barrels. Current production is roughly 2.2 million barrels per day, of which 1.8 million barrels are exported and 400,000 barrels are consumed domestically. If exports stop completely, storage fills in 47 days. But exports have not stopped completely. They have dropped by 73%, which means approximately 390,000 barrels per day are still finding buyers willing to pay premium prices to cover the risk of Hormuz transit. The remaining 1.4 million barrels per day that cannot be exported are flowing into storage. At that rate, storage capacity is exhausted in 60 days. This is not a projection. This is arithmetic, and when storage is full, production shuts down. Not gradually, not strategically. Immediately, because oil wells cannot simply stop pumping without suffering permanent damage to the reservoir that makes future production impossible or economically unviable. The wells have to be shut in properly, which requires technical procedures that take weeks and specialized personnel that Iran is already short on because of sanctions and brain drain. If Iran is forced into emergency well shutdown, it could take 18 months to bring production back online, even after shipping resumes. The economic damage would be measured in tens of billions of dollars in lost revenue and permanent reduction in Iran's oil production capacity. 60 days. That is the window before this becomes irreversible. And the clock started running the moment American intelligence convinced shipping companies to avoid Hormuz. Now look at what this means for China's strategic calculations. Beijing has spent 20 years building an economic relationship with Iran that serves Chinese interests across multiple domains. Iran supplies roughly 800,000 barrels per day of oil to Chinese refineries under long-term contracts priced below market rates. Iran provides geographic access to Central Asian markets through rail and road infrastructure that bypasses Russian and Western-controlled routes. Iran offers a testing ground for Chinese military hardware and surveillance technology that cannot be deployed domestically without attracting international condemnation. And Iran serves as a pressure point against American power in the Middle East that diverts Washington's attention away from the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. That entire strategic architecture is now at risk. If Iran's economy collapses, China loses a client state that cost Beijing decades of diplomatic investment and billions in infrastructure funding. If Iran's government falls, the replacement regime will almost certainly be more pro-Western, because any government that overthrows the Islamic Republic will need American and European support to survive. If Iran loses its ability to threaten Hormuz, China loses leverage over global oil prices and the ability to use Middle Eastern chaos to distract American strategic focus. Beijing cannot allow that outcome. But Beijing also cannot prevent it without directly confronting American naval power in the Persian Gulf, which would require China to operate its navy 8,000 miles from home waters, in a theater where the U.S. military has overwhelming advantage. This is a test that Xi Jinping did not want and cannot afford to fail. China's response in the next 2 weeks will reveal more about Beijing's actual capabilities and risk tolerance than the last decade of South China Sea posturing, because this is not a crisis China can win by building artificial islands or flying jets near Taiwan. This is a crisis that requires China to deploy hard power in a region where it has minimal military presence and zero allied support. The United States knows this. And the fact that Washington engineered a crisis that forces Beijing to choose between humiliating abandonment of a key partner and catastrophically expensive military intervention in the Persian Gulf suggests that someone in the Pentagon has been waiting years for this exact opportunity. But here is the layer of this story that the headlines are not capturing. The secret operation is not the Hormuz shipping disruption. That is the visible piece. The secret operation is what is happening in the information space inside Iran. American psychological operations units have been running a sophisticated influence campaign inside Iranian government communication networks for the last 11 days. The operation does not involve hacking or electronic warfare. It involves something far more elegant. Authentic leaked documents from internal IRGC communications channels are being amplified through social media networks in ways that make them appear to be grassroots leaks from disaffected Revolutionary Guard members. The documents show internal disagreement about the Hormuz attacks, reveal that senior commanders warned against the operation, and demonstrate that the orders came from a small faction within the IRGC leadership acting without supreme leader approval. This is not disinformation. These are real documents describing real disagreements. The operation is not creating false information. It is amplifying true information that the regime wanted to keep internal. And the effect inside Iran is catastrophic for regime cohesion. Mid-level IRGC commanders who opposed the Hormuz attacks now know that their objections were overruled by a small clique. They know that their concerns about escalation were ignored, and they know that the Supreme Leader's authority was circumvented. That knowledge is fracturing the Revolutionary Guard's internal unity in ways that external pressure never could. Officers who spent careers following orders are now questioning whether the orders they are receiving come from legitimate authority or from a rogue faction that is steering Iran toward a war that serves factional interests rather than national survival. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented reality being weaponized through strategic amplification. And the most dangerous part is not what the leaked documents reveal about the past. It is what they reveal about the present. The current IRGC command structure is divided into 3 factions with fundamentally incompatible visions for how Iran should respond to the Hormuz crisis. The first faction wants immediate de-escalation, restoration of presidential authority, and return to negotiations with European intermediaries. The second faction wants escalation, formal closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and confrontation with the United States that forces China to intervene on Iran's behalf. The third faction wants neither escalation nor de-escalation. It wants the crisis to continue indefinitely in a state of managed tension that justifies emergency powers, prevents civilian government from reasserting control, and enables the Guard to consolidate power through the chaos. Those 3 factions are not debating in conference rooms. They are maneuvering assets, securing loyalties, and preparing for the possibility that this crisis ends not with American military victory, but with Iranian civil conflict that makes Syria's war look organized. The ships that are avoiding Hormuz are not coming back until someone guarantees their safety. Iran cannot provide that guarantee without first regaining control of the rogue commanders who ordered the attacks. But regaining that control requires the Supreme Leader to purge military officers who have spent decades building independent power bases and who will not surrender that power without a fight. If the Supreme Leader orders the purge, he risks IRGC mutiny that could topple the government within days. If he does not order the purge, shipping continues avoiding Hormuz, oil revenue continues collapsing, and economic pressure triggers the popular uprising that the regime has been suppressing for 15 years. There is no scenario where Tehran emerges from this crisis with its strategic position intact. The question is not whether Iran loses. The question is how badly Iran loses and whether the losing is managed or chaotic. And right now, every indicator suggests chaos. The Pentagon is not talking about this publicly because there is no operational benefit to explaining the trap while Iran is still sitting in it. American policy at this moment is to let the clock run. Let storage capacity fill. Let oil revenue collapse. Let internal IRGC factions turn on each other as the economic pressure intensifies and different commanders blame each other for the strategic disaster they collectively created. Then, when Iran is sufficiently weakened, when regime cohesion is sufficiently fractured, when the economic damage is sufficiently irreversible, Washington will offer terms. And those terms will not be the negotiated compromise that President Pezeshkian was working towards 6 weeks ago. Those terms will be dictated settlement that strips Iran of its nuclear program, dismantles its regional proxy networks, and subordinates Iranian foreign policy to American security guarantees in exchange for the economic relief that keeps the regime from complete collapse. This is not speculation. This is the documented policy framework that has been sitting in classified Pentagon planning documents since the maximum pressure campaign failed to produce regime change. The difference is that this time Iran created the crisis, this time Iran attacked first, and this time the international community will accept American terms because the alternative is watching global oil markets spiral into chaos that no producing country wants. The cargo ships stacked up off the coast of Oman are waiting for a signal that never comes. The insurance underwriters are waiting for risk assessments that cannot be provided. The oil traders are waiting for clarity that does not exist. And inside Tehran, in rooms where men who have been fighting each other since the Iran-Iraq War are making calculations that will determine whether the Islamic Republic survives the next 90 days, the waiting is over. The choices are narrowing. The arithmetic is undeniable. And the clock is running. 10 to 14 days until Iran's oil storage reaches critical capacity. 60 days until emergency well shutdowns become unavoidable. 90 days until economic damage becomes structurally irreversible, even if shipping resumes. The United States is not counting down to military action. It is counting down to strategic capitulation. And the Pentagon's secret operation is not designed to force that capitulation through military strikes. It is designed to make capitulation the only rational choice that Iran's leadership can make if they want the regime to exist in any recognizable form beyond the next quarterly earnings report from state oil companies that are hemorrhaging revenue they can never recover. This is not war. This is economic strangulation, executed with surgical precision by people who understand that the most devastating military operations are the ones that never require firing a shot. The Strait of Hormuz is open. Ships are simply choosing not to use it. And that choice, multiplied across every shipping company and every cargo manifest and every insurance calculation, is producing the outcome that 43 years of military threats and economic sanctions could never achieve. Iran is surrendering the only strategic asset that made it matter. And it is surrendering that asset not because America forced the surrender at gunpoint, but because Iran forced itself into a trap that only exists because Tehran believed its own threat was real enough to use. The show is over. What replaces it is not another act of the same performance. What replaces it is the endgame that everyone knew was coming, but nobody wanted to trigger because triggering it meant accepting the consequences of watching a regional power disintegrate in real time while trying to control the fallout. That disintegration is now inevitable. The timeline is measurable. And the only question left is whether the people making decisions in Tehran understand the trap before the trap closes completely, or whether they keep playing the only hand they know until the hand is forced from their grip by commanders who decide that survival requires replacing the leadership that led them into this abyss. The answer is still being decided. In Tehran, in tunnels, in rooms where men who built careers on the threat to close Hormuz are discovering that the threat only worked as long as they never used it. The world is watching. The shipping lanes are empty, and the clock has never been closer to midnight.